Professor Jamie Raskin thought he had the ultimate mic drop moment to humiliate Louisiana voters on national television, but he never anticipated Senator John Kennedy weaponizing a one-year-old Harvard Law Review article to completely dismantle him. Jamie Raskin had rehearsed the habeas corpus line for 11 days, in front of his wife, in front of his chief of staff, and in front of the mirror in his Tacoma Park bathroom at 6:00 inches the morning, 3 days in a row. He delivered it at minute 11 of the House Judiciary Committee hearing. And then Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana lifted an old leather-bound book from the desk in front of him, and the professor's afternoon began to end. Senator Kennedy represents a state where, frankly, I am not sure they can spell habeas corpus, let alone understand the constitutional foundations of the Ethics in Government Act. Jamie Raskin was 11 minutes into his opening statement in House Judiciary Committee Room 2141 when he delivered the line, and Senator John Kennedy, sitting across from him with an old leather-bound book on the desk in front of him, made a small note in the margin of the book's first page. He waited for the Maryland congressman to finish his lecture. The book was the Harvard Law Review, Volume 98, published in 1984. Kennedy had not opened it in 20 years. He had brought it to the hearing that morning because he had known 4 weeks in advance, when his staff had first seen the witness list, that Jamie Raskin was going to say something exactly like the habeas corpus line, and Kennedy had decided that when Raskin said it, he was going to respond with the one thing in the world that Jamie Raskin, Harvard Law class of 1987, would not be prepared for. The one thing in the world Kennedy had written himself as a 2-year-old law student, 3 years before Raskin had even started his first year at Harvard Law. The hearing room was full reporters from every major network, 200 spectators in the gallery, and Capitol Police at every door. The joint House Judiciary Committee hearing on financial disclosure reform and congressional ethics had been scheduled by Chairman Jim Jordan 3 weeks earlier, at the request of the ranking member, Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. Raskin had pushed for the hearing because he wanted to put the late Republican financial disclosures of 53 GOP members on the record. He had not expected a senator from Louisiana to show up with a leather-bound book. Jordan banged the gavel. He was not a man who needed a big gesture to be heard. He had been a college wrestling coach for 2 decades before coming to Congress, and his voice carried in a hearing room the way a wrestling coach's voice carries in a gymnasium. This joint hearing of the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee will come to order. Today we examine proposed reforms to financial disclosure requirements under the Ethics in Government Act and the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act. Ranking Member Raskin, you are recognized for an opening statement. Jamie Raskin stood up. He was 62 years old, slim, quiet, the kind of man who had spent 25 years teaching constitutional law to future federal judges and knew how to command a room through precision rather than volume. He did not shout, he did not point, and he did not use the theatrical gestures that Democrats like Maxine Waters used when they were trying to make a point. Raskin was different. Raskin lectured. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we begin examining the proposed reforms, I want to frame this conversation historically and constitutionally. The Ethics in Government Act of 1978 was passed in the immediate aftermath of W. at Turgate. It was a bipartisan response to the most serious constitutional crisis since the Civil W. at R. It established mandatory financial disclosure requirements for senior federal officials and members of Congress, requirements that, as we sit here today, are being systematically violated by members of the Republican Party. His voice carried the practiced authority of a 5-year professor at American University Washington College of Law. Some of the Democratic staffers in the audience nodded automatically, the reflex of students agreeing with a teacher they had been trained to agree with. This committee has documented that 53 Republican members of Congress failed to file timely financial disclosures in the last fiscal year alone. That is not a partisan smear, that is a matter of public record, documented by the Office of Congressional Ethics, verified by the House Clerk's office, and alarming to anyone who believes that public servants owe the public the truth about their financial affairs. The party that claims to stand for law and order cannot, it appears, comply with the basic disclosure requirements governing its own money. He paused, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked across the hearing room at Kennedy, using the professorial gesture, an open palm, not a pointing finger, and the most visible representative of this culture of non-compliance, the man who has built a national brand out of folksy disrespect for constitutional complexity, is sitting across from me right now. Senator Kennedy represents a state where, frankly, I am not sure they can spell habeas corpus, let alone understand the constitutional foundations of the Ethics in Government Act. He has built his career on a performance, the drawl, the mimosa stories, the aw-shucks routine designed to persuade his voters that anti-intellectualism is a virtue. It is not a virtue, it is a disease, and it is dismantling American democracy. I taught constitutional law for 25 years at American University, Washington College of Law. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School in 1987. I was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. I am telling you today, with the full weight of that background, that performative folksiness is not a substitute for constitutional literacy. Senator Kennedy has made a career out of pretending they are the same thing. They are not. Eric Swalwell nodded vigorously from his seat. Dan Goldman, the former Southern District of New York federal prosecutor, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The Democratic side of the room was energized. This was going to be the clip, this was going to be the Jamie Raskin moment that progressive Twitter would share for the next 48 hours. But Raskin was not finished. And more broadly, Mr. Chairman, because this hearing is about more than one senator from one state, the Republican Party has become a threat to American democracy itself. I led the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump in February of 2021. I stood in the United States Senate chamber and prosecuted the case that a sitting American president had incited a Mage 0R, Vic Disrupti 0N, against the government of the United States. I presented video evidence, I cited the Constitution, and I made the case for what I believed then, and still believe, that Donald Trump should have been convicted. Senator Kennedy voted to acquit. He stood on the floor of the Senate and decided that the man who had incited the events at this very building, these halls, this chamber, should face no consequences. And now he sits across from me and has the audacity to lecture this committee about legal ethics. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time. But I want the record to reflect one final thought. The American people deserve better than what they are being given by the senator from Louisiana. They deserve actual constitutional scholarship. They deserve actual accountability. And they deserve a Senate that does not confuse a Louisiana drawl with a legal argument. He sat down. The Democratic side of the room applauded. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with the particular approving silence that academics use when one of their own has just delivered a good lecture. Goldman clapped twice and stopped. Swalwell clapped 3 times. Several staffers in the audience whispered to each other. Jordan looked across the hearing table at Kennedy. Senator Kennedy, you are recognized for questions. Kennedy did not stand. Kennedy almost never stood in hearings. His knees were 73 years old, and he had decided a long time ago that standing in hearings was for men who needed the height to compensate for something they lacked in arguments. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a white handkerchief. The handkerchief was old. It had been stitched by his grandmother in 1962, when John Kennedy was 11 years old and she was still alive, and she had wanted her grandson to have something to clean his glasses with when he went to law school someday. The monogram had almost faded, but Kennedy could still read it if he held the handkerchief in the right light. He cleaned his smudged glasses slowly. He put them back on. He placed his right hand gently on top of the leather-bound book in front of him, the way a preacher places his hand on a Bible before giving a sermon. "Well, Mr. Raskin, that was a mighty impressive opening. I particularly enjoyed the part where you said, 'My state can dispel habeas corpus.' That was very clever. My mama used to say, 'If you have to tell people you're smart, you probably ain't as smart as you think you are.'" He paused. The room was quiet. "But I didn't come here today to talk about Ma. I came here to talk about you, Mr. Raskin. And before I do, I want to address one thing you said, because it bothered me. And I think it bothered a lot of people watching at home. You said Louisiana can't spell habeas corpus. Mr. Raskin, my state, the state I have represented in the United States Senate since 2017, has 1.4 million registered voters. Most of them are farmers, welders, oil and gas workers, shrimpers, truck drivers, teachers, and small business owners. They get up before dawn, they pay their bills on time, they file their taxes on time, they raise their children to respect the law, they go to church on Sunday, and they put their spare change in the collection plate. When you stood up in this hearing room just now and said they cannot spell habeas corpus, you did not insult me. Mr. Raskin, I have been called worse by better. You insulted them, and they deserve a response, so I am going to give them one. He gripped the leather-bound book, held it up so the cameras on all four corners of the room could see the gold lettering on the spine. Faded but legible Harvard Law Review, Volume 98, 1984. This, Mr. Raskin, is the Harvard Law Review, Volume 98, published in 1984. I do not usually carry it around. I keep this particular copy on a shelf in my office in the Russell Senate office building, on the second shelf, between a photograph of my granddaddy, a firefighter with Shreveport Engine Company, for 41 years, and a bottle of Tabasco sauce that my daughter Annie gave me in 2008. I keep the Law Review on that shelf because I keep the important things there. He opened the book to a page that had been marked with a red ribbon bookmark for 23 years. There is an article in here, Mr. Raskin. It is 78 pages long. It is heavily footnoted. It cites the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, the Senate Select Committee on Ethics, 12 separate federal cases, anticipating what would eventually become the Stock Act. And I looked this up again on the plane last night. Approximately 390 separate legal authorities, most of them in Latin. The title of the article is Financial Disclosure Requirements under the Ethics in Government Act, Enforcement Mechanisms, and Constitutional Tensions. Very long, very boring. The kind of article nobody reads, except constitutional law professors. He looked up from the page. His eyes found Raskin S. The author of this article, Mr. Raskin, is a third-year law student named John N. Kennedy. That's me. I wrote it in 1984 at the University of Virginia School of Law, which is where I went after I finished at Vanderbilt University, magna cum laude, class of 73, which was where I went after Zachary High School in Zachary, Louisiana. I also picked up a civil law degree from Magdalen College, Oxford, in 1976, the BCL program. I studied under Professor Tony Honoré, who you have probably heard of. He wrote the standard casebook on Roman law that is still used at Harvard today. I do not usually mention these things, Mr. Raskin. My granddaddy taught me that a man who leads with his credentials is trying to cover up something else he does not have. But you just stood up in front of this committee and said Louisiana cannot spell habeas corpus, so I feel compelled to mention that I spent 7 years studying exactly that law in 3 different institutions on 2 different continents before I ever argued my first case in Louisiana State Court, and I published my first academic article on financial disclosure requirements in the Harvard Law Review 41 years ago, which is, I should note for the record, approximately 3 years before you graduated from Harvard Law School. The hearing room was not silent, but the quality of the sound had changed. Raskin's face did not move. Raskin was a professional, and Raskin had faced hostile questions for 25 years in front of American university law students. But Eric Swalwell, sitting to Raskin's right, had stopped smiling. Dan Goldman, on the other side, had put down his pen. The Democratic staffers who had been whispering a minute earlier were now staring straight ahead. Now, Mr. Raskin, if you will permit me, and I know you will because you are a lawyer, and lawyers respect the form, I would like to talk about what I wrote in this article in 1984, because the law I was writing about 41 years ago is the exact law the Office of Congressional Ethics says your wife violated in 2022, and I want to read you what I wrote about it, back when you were a first year at Harvard Law, and I was already publishing on this topic. Kennedy opened the book to page 912. The page was dog-eared. It had been dog-eared for decades, not by him, but by the Law Review staff who had proofread the article in 1984. He had kept the copy exactly the way they had given it to him. Page 912, Section 4. I am quoting directly from my article in 1984, and I want everyone watching at home on C-SPAN, including the voters in Louisiana who, according to Mr. Raskin, cannot spell habeas corpus, to follow along, because the words I wrote 41 years ago apply to the members of this committee today with what I would call uncomfortable precision. Quote, the periodic transaction report requirement under Section 207 of the Ethics in Government Act was designed to prevent members of Congress, their spouses, and their dependent children from profiting from non-public information obtained through congressional service. The 30-day disclosure window was selected specifically because Congress, in drafting the act, understood that market-moving information loses its relevance over time and that a delay of even a few months would effectively nullify the disclosure requirement. End quote. He looked up from the book. I was 22 when I wrote that sentence, Mr. Raskin, barely old enough to rent a car at a Hertz counter, and I understood at 22 that the entire purpose of the 30-day disclosure rule was to prevent the exact thing you did in 2022. He turned a page. The book was well worn, and the pages turned easily. Your wife, Sarah Bloom Raskin, is a distinguished legal scholar, Harvard College, Harvard Law School, former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury under President Obama. I have read her published work. I have respect for her credentials. I want to make that clear on the record, because what I am about to say is not an attack on your wife's intelligence or her scholarship. In 2017, Sarah Bloom Raskin joined the board of a Colorado-based financial technology company called Reserve Trust. In exchange for her board service, she received equity compensation. This was, at the time, a lawful arrangement. Board service is a common activity for distinguished former Treasury officials. It was not a scandal in 2017, and nothing I am saying today suggests it was. In December of 2020, Reserve Trust was sold. Your wife received approximately $1.5 million from that sale. The transaction date on the federal financial disclosure forms is December 18, 2020. That is a matter of public record. Under Section 207 of the Ethics in Government Act, the section I just quoted from my own 1984 Law Review article, you were required as a sitting member of the United States Congress to disclose that transaction within 45 days. The deadline was approximately February 1, 2021. you did not file the disclosure. Not in February, not in March, not in April, not in May, not in June, not in July. You filed it in August of 2021. 216 days past the legal deadline. 8 months late. This is not my analysis, Mr. Raskin. This was reported first by Fox Business News, and then by Business Insider in February of 2022. The basic facts are not in dispute. The American Accountability Foundation filed a formal ethics complaint against you in 2024. A separate complaint was filed by the Center for Renewing America, which is headed by former Office of Management and Budget Director Russ Vought. Both complaints remain part of the public record. Raskin's reply came quickly. His voice was calm. Raskin's voice was always calm, but there was an edge to it that had not been there a minute earlier. Senator Kennedy, I am going to address this directly because you are misrepresenting the record. I fully acknowledged the late filing at the time it was reported. I paid all applicable penalties. The Office of Congressional Ethics did not refer the matter for further action by the House Ethics Committee. This was a technical paperwork violation, not a substantive ethics violation, and any fair-minded legal scholar reviewing the record would recognize the distinction between. Kennedy raised a hand. Not quickly, not sharply, the way a country lawyer raises a hand when he is about to interrupt opposing counsel in a Louisiana courtroom. Mr. Raskin, I have not finished reading from my article. With the chairman's permission, may I continue? Jordan nodded. Proceed. Paragraph 3 of Section 4. Page 913. I am quoting my two-year-old self. Again, quote, the temptation to characterize late disclosures as technical or inadvertent will be significant, particularly when the violator has plausible deniability regarding the specific transaction. However, the Act does not distinguish between technical and substantive violations for enforcement purposes, because the legislative intent was to create a bright-line rule. Any violation is, by definition, substantive, because the entire purpose of the rule is to prevent the precise delay that a technical characterization would permit. End quote. He closed the book halfway, keeping his finger on the page. My two-year-old self specifically anticipated the argument you just made, Mr. Raskin. I predicted that people caught violating this statute would say it was just a technical violation, and I explained why that defense should not be accepted. So when you say this was a technical violation, Mr. Raskin, I am not arguing with you. I am arguing with a two-year-old law student who wrote 78 pages about this exact question 41 years ago, and the two-year-old law student reading your defense in 1984, before you had even finished your first semester at Harvard, would have dismissed your argument in approximately 9 seconds. Josh Hawley leaned into his microphone. It was the first time he had spoken during the hearing. Hawley was 46 years old, the youngest man in the Senate. A graduate of Stanford University, Yale Law School, and a former clerk for Chief Justice John Roberts of the United States Supreme Court. He had been sitting to Kennedy's left, quietly taking notes, waiting for the moment when his voice would be needed. The moment was now. Mr. Chairman, if Senator Kennedy will yield for 30 seconds, I want to add something to the legal record. I clerked for Chief Justice John Roberts on the Supreme Court of the United States in 2007 and 2008. I taught constitutional law at the University of Missouri before coming to the Senate. I have argued cases before federal appellate courts. I want to be precise about the technical violation framing that Congressman Raskin just offered this committee, because the framing is legally wrong, and it matters that it is wrong. The Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, the Stock Act, passed the United States Congress in 2012, 96 to 3 inches the Senate, 417 to 2 inches the House. It was signed into law by President Barack Obama. The Stock Act specifically closed the kind of delayed disclosure loophole that Senator Kennedy's 1984 Law Review article anticipated as a future problem. The Stock Act, as written, does not have a technical versus substantive exception. That distinction does not exist in the text of the statute. I have read the statute. I have read the legislative history. I have read the case law, interpreting both. The distinction Congressman Raskin is drawing is a distinction that exists in his head and in his talking points, but not in the United States Code. So when Congressman Raskin describes his wife's undisclosed $1.5 million transaction as a technical violation, he is using a legal category that does not exist in the law. He is, with respect, making up a defense that the statute does not provide. And with even more respect, because he and I have served together on the Senate Judiciary Committee conference meetings, and I like him personally, he knows the text of the Stock Act. He knows it better than I do. He is choosing to ignore the text because the text convicts him. Dan Goldman finally spoke. Goldman was 49 years old, a Yale Law School graduate, a former assistant United States attorney for the Southern District of New York, and one of the most credentialed Democrats in the House Judiciary Committee. He had been a federal prosecutor for 10 years before his family money allowed him to run for Congress. He understood how to make a legal argument. Mr. Chairman, Senator Hawley is engaging in legally misleading rhetoric, and I have to correct the record. As a former federal prosecutor with 10 years of experience in the Southern District of New York, and as a Yale Law School graduate, class of 2005, I want to be precise about what strict liability under Section 207 does and does not mean. Strict liability under the Ethics in Government Act does not automatically convert a late filing into a substantive violation. The Office of Congressional Ethics specifically declined to refer this matter for further action by the House Ethics Committee. Under federal precedent, non-referral by the Office of Congressional Ethics is equivalent to a finding that the underlying conduct does not warrant further investigation. Congressman Raskin has been cleared by the relevant. Kennedy raised his hand again. Mr. Goldman, I respect Yale Law School. I truly do. I have friends who teach there. Yale Law School has produced some of the finest legal minds in American constitutional history. I want to give that institution its due. Let me ask you a specific question, Mr. Goldman, because you invoked your Yale credentials. Yale Law School has also produced Justice Sonia Sotomayor, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Justice Samuel Alito, and Justice Clarence Thomas. All four of them currently sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. All four of them have written opinions on the record stating that statutory compliance deadlines are not discretionary when the statute creates strict liability. Two of those four justices were appointed by Republican presidents. Two were appointed by Democratic presidents. They do not agree on much, Mr. Goldman, but they agree on this. So, when you invoke Yale Law School to defend your argument tonight, I am asking you a simple question. Which Yale Law School graduate, Supreme Court justice, federal judge, or tenured professor would join you in arguing that missing a congressional disclosure deadline by 8 months is a technical violation? Name one, Mr. Goldman. Name anyone. Goldman opened his mouth, closed it. He looked down at the notes in front of him. He looked up. He looked at Raskin. He looked back at Kennedy. He did not name anyone. He could not. The silence lasted 4 seconds and felt like 40. Kennedy waited 1 more second, then continued. Thank you, Mr. Goldman. I appreciate the clarification. In January of 2022, Mr. Raskin, President Joseph R. Biden nominated your wife, Sarah Bloom Raskin, to serve as the Federal Reserve's Vice Chair for Supervision. For the people watching at home who do not know what that position is, I want to explain it slowly, because it matters more than anything I have said today. The Vice Chair for Supervision is the single most powerful banking regulator in the United States of America. The person who holds that position supervises and regulates the largest banks in the American financial system. They approve or reject bank mergers. They impose fines for regulatory violations. They set capital requirements. They review compliance of financial technology companies, including, I should note for the record, financial technology companies like Reserve Trust, from which your wife had recently received $1.5 million. I want to walk through the timeline of events slowly, because the sequence matters, and I want everyone watching to be able to follow it without getting lost. December 18th, 2020, the transaction occurs. Sarah Bloom Raskin receives approximately $1.5 million from Reserve Trust. February 1st, 2021, the legal deadline for you to disclose that transaction. You missed the deadline. August 2021, you finally file the disclosure 8 months late. The 13th of January 2022, President Biden nominates your wife to be the Federal Reserve's top banking regulator. February 2022, Fox Business News and Business Insider break the story of the late filing. The 15th of March 2022, your wife withdraws her Federal Reserve nomination. 6 weeks, Mr. Raskin, from nomination to withdrawal, one of the shortest Federal Reserve nominations in modern history. Not because of partisan obstruction by Republicans, not because of policy disagreements over monetary theory. Because of your financial disclosure failure, he closed the book entirely, did not need it for what came next. Here is the question I want to ask you, Mr. Raskin. I am not going to frame it as a political attack. I am going to frame it as one law school graduate asking another law school graduate a question that deserves a straightforward answer. Your wife had received $1.5 million from a financial technology company. That company would have been directly regulated by the position to which she was being nominated. The Ethics in Government Act's disclosure requirement exists specifically to prevent conflicts of interest in exactly this situation. You missed the disclosure deadline by 8 months. During those 8 months, your wife was under active consideration for one of the most sensitive banking regulatory positions in the federal government. My question, Mr. Raskin, is straightforward. Did you miss the deadline by accident? Or did you miss it because disclosing a $1.5 million payout from a fintech company would have derailed your wife's nomination before it even began? Raskin's face tightened. He had prepared for almost every question imaginable before this hearing. He had not prepared for this one. Senator Kennedy, that is an offensive and false suggestion. The late filing was an administrative oversight. I have acknowledged it publicly. I have paid the penalties. My wife withdrew her nomination voluntarily to avoid further distraction from the administration's priorities. There was no concealment, no C0 no conflict of interest. Mr. Raskin, I did not accuse you of a C0 I asked you a question, and I noticed that you did not actually answer it. You described the sequence of events, which is not in dispute, and then you drew a conclusion, no concealment. But you did not answer whether you missed the deadline by accident or by design. My two-year-old self anticipated this problem too. In the same 1984 article, page 927, quote, "The difficulty of proving intent in disclosure violations is precisely why Congress imposed strict liability for the filing deadline. A member who missed the deadline could always claim the delay was inadvertent, and since intent is essentially unprovable in the context of administrative failures, the enforcement of the act would become effectively optional. The solution Congress chose was to make the delay itself the violation, regardless of the underlying intent." End quote. The question, Mr. Raskin, is not whether you meant to miss the deadline. The question is whether you missed it. And the answer to that question, which you have publicly confirmed in multiple press statements, is yes. You missed it by 8 months, while your wife was being considered for the most powerful banking regulatory position in America. Eric Swalwell leaned into his microphone. Swalwell was 44 years old, a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Law. He had been in Congress for 13 years. He was widely regarded as Jamie Raskin, as closest political friend in the House Democratic caucus. When Raskin was in trouble, Swalwell was the man who stepped in to defend him. Mr. Chairman, I have to object to this line of questioning. Senator Kennedy is attempting to turn a bureaucratic filing delay into a C0 conspiracy theory. This is exactly the kind of partisan targeting. Kennedy turned his chair slightly to face Swalwell. His voice did not change. It remained quiet, patient, Louisiana soft. Congressman Swalwell, I appreciate the intervention. I want to address it directly because you, of all people, may want to be cautious about lecturing other members on the subject of disclosure issues. Swalwell blinked. In 2015, Congressman Swalwell, the Federal Bureau of Investigation briefed you about your contacts with an individual who was subsequently identified in public reporting as a suspected foreign intelligence operative. The briefing and the circumstances surrounding it were reported publicly by Axios in December of 2020. Following those public reports, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a member of your own party, the leader of the House Democratic caucus, removed you from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. That is not a Republican at CK. That is a decision made by your own Democratic Speaker, based on publicly available information. I am not raising this to embarrass you, Congressman. I am raising it because this committee, the House Judiciary Committee, has a broader disclosure problem that goes beyond Mr. Raskin. And when you intervene to defend Mr. Raskin's 8-month late filing as a bureaucratic delay, you are standing on ground that I do not think you want to be standing on with respect. Swalwell's face went red. He looked at Raskin. Raskin did not look back. Swalwell looked down at his papers and did not speak again for the next 26 minutes. For those paying attention to the unfolding drama, the scene was a masterclass in humility. Senator John Kennedy had just quoted his very own Harvard Law Review article at a Harvard law professor. He had crushed a Yale law prosecutor with a single, unanswerable question. He had entirely silenced Eric Swalwell with a surgical reference to a prior leadership decision. And the chilling reality was that Kennedy had not even reached the deeper layer of the family foundation, nor the broader behavioral pattern he was about to expose. The systemic nature of this culture of exceptionalism was only beginning to be laid bare on the record. Kennedy waited for the room to settle. He did not rush. He was a country lawyer who had spent 40 years learning that the most devastating moments in any courtroom came in the silence between the question and the answer, not in the volume of the question itself. Mr. Raskin, I want to zoom out for a moment, because what we are discussing today is not just you as an individual. It is a pattern, and the pattern is what I really want the American people watching on C-SPAN to see. Your father, Marcus Raskin, co-founded the Institute for Policy Studies in 1963. He served on the National Security Council under President John F. Kennedy before founding it. The Institute for Policy Studies has played a significant role in American progressive politics for 60 years. Having a father who founded an influential think tank is not a scandal. Mr. Raskin, my own father was a state court judge in Louisiana. I am proud of his career. I learned most of what I know about cross-examination sitting in the back of his courtroom when I was 9 years old. I am not embarrassed by his work, and you should not be embarrassed by your father's. What I want to discuss is something specific. According to public tax records, which anyone watching can pull up on the Internal Revenue Service website tonight, the Institute for Policy Studies has received funding over its 60-year history from sources that include the Samuel Rubin Foundation, the Rockefeller Family Fund, the Ford Foundation, and, this is the part I find historically interesting, from front organizations that were linked in the early 2000s to the government of Venezuela. That linkage is documented in congressional testimony from the Heritage Foundation in 2008 and confirmed by the Institute for Policy Studies' own publicly filed tax returns. I am not suggesting, Mr. Raskin, that your father was a foreign agent. I am not suggesting that the Institute for Policy Studies is a foreign front organization. I am not employing historical scare tactics, and this is not the 1950s. I want that on the record clearly, because I know what is going to be said about this line of questioning the moment the hearing ends. What I am noting is that the Institute for Policy Studies has taken foreign policy positions over 6 decades that have, by happy coincidence, aligned with the interests of countries that are not always aligned with the interests of the United States. And you, Mr. Raskin, as a sitting member of the House Judiciary Committee and the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, have never, to my knowledge, publicly disclosed the full extent of your family's ongoing personal and financial relationship with this organization. I have 3 specific yes or no questions. I would like you to answer them. Is your wife currently receiving compensation from the Institute for Policy Studies or any organization affiliated with it? Have you personally received speaking fees, book royalties, or consulting fees from the Institute for Policy Studies in the last 5 years? Has your surviving daughter worked at any organizations affiliated with or funded by the Institute for Policy Studies? Raskin raised his voice for the first time in the hearing. It was not shouting. It was still the voice of a 25-year constitutional law professor. But there was an edge to it now, the edge of a man who was defending his family against a line of questioning he had not expected and did not know how to deflect. Senator Kennedy, this is historical scare tactics, dressed up in a Louisiana accent. My father was a distinguished public intellectual who served 3 American presidents. The Institute for Policy Studies is a legitimate, respected policy organization that has contributed to American democratic discourse for 6 decades. This line of questioning is exactly the kind of 1950s scare tactics that were used to destroy innocent Americans in the past. And I will not dignify it with a point-by-point, Mr. Raskin, I did not accuse you of being a foreign agent. I did not mention historical smear tactics. You did. I asked 3 specific yes or no questions. I will ask them again, slowly, one at a time. Is your wife compensated by the Institute for Policy Studies? Raskin paused. The pause was longer than it should have been. Everyone in the hearing room noticed. My wife has given lectures at events affiliated with the Institute for Policy Studies. She was not compensated for these specific lectures, to the best of my knowledge. Have you received fees from the Institute for Policy Studies in the last 5 years? Another pause. I have given public talks at the Institute for Policy Studies over the years. I have not received speaking fees for those talks, to the best of my knowledge. I would have to check whether book royalties from my published works include any distribution through IPS-affiliated channels. See, Mr. Raskin, that is exactly the kind of answer I was concerned about. I would have to check is not a no. That is an I do not know. And, for a sitting member of the House Judiciary Committee who has publicly admitted to violating Section 207 of the Ethics in Government Act by 8 months, the answer, I would have to check on your own family's financial connections to a 60-year-old policy organization, is not, I am afraid, a reassuring answer. Kennedy leaned forward. This was the moment he had been building toward for the entire hearing. He set the Harvard Law Review back down on the desk. He did not need it for what came next. What came next was not legal scholarship, it was a broader case. But Mr. Raskin, I want to expand this discussion beyond you personally, because what I really want to talk about is the pattern. the pattern across the entire Democratic Party establishment that you represent. His voice was still quiet, but it was carrying now. Every camera in the room was on him. You are one member of a Democratic establishment that has built itself around credentialism. Barack Obama, Harvard Law School. Hillary Clinton, Yale Law School. Elizabeth Warren, Harvard Law Professor. Kamala Harris, Hastings Law. Pete Buttigieg, Harvard College. Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. Your wife, Sarah, Harvard College, Harvard Law School. Almost every single leader of your party for the last 40 years has come from the same 6 or 8 institutions, and every single one of them has been trained in the same elite culture to believe the same thing, that the rules exist for other people. Rules for the farmers, rules for the welders, rules for the truck drivers, rules for the small business owners in my state who, according to you, cannot spell habeas corpus because they grew up in Louisiana. But when a Democratic Harvard Law graduate misses a disclosure deadline by 8 months, that's technical. When a Democratic senator's family trades unprivileged information, that's a paperwork issue. When a sitting Judiciary Committee member's wife earns $1.5 million from a financial technology company, while that committee member sits on committees that regulate financial technology, that's family finances that have nothing to do with my legislative work. Mr. Raskin, the Democratic Party has become a party of credentialed hypocrites, and I want to say this carefully because I do not take any joy in saying it. I grew up in a state where the Democratic Party was the dominant political force for 80 consecutive years. My own father was a Democrat. I myself was a registered Democrat for 25 years of my adult life. I did not change parties in 2007 because I became a conservative on social issues. I changed parties because the Democratic Party had become a club for people with the right degrees, from the right schools. And the right degrees, I noticed over time, had started to count more than the right values. The people watching this hearing at home know what I am talking about. They live with the consequences of this pattern every single day. They pay their taxes on time because if they do not, the Internal Revenue Service will come after them, and it will not accept technical violation as a defense. They file their financial disclosures on time because if they do not, they lose their professional licenses. They follow the rules because the rules are the only thing standing between them and ruin. And then they watch a Harvard law professor miss a disclosure by 8 months and call it technical. And they wonder, correctly, why the rules are a bright line for them and a suggestion for you. The American people do not resent your degrees, Mr. Raskin. They resent your exceptions. The hearing room was silent. Jim Jordan was leaning forward in the chairman's seat, his elbows on the committee table, his face expressionless. Even the Democratic staffers who had been whispering to each other during the earlier portions of the hearing had stopped whispering. Several reporters in the gallery had stopped typing. Josh Hawley, sitting to Kennedy's left, did not speak. He did not need to speak. He simply nodded once, slowly, the way a lawyer nods when his co-counsel has just made the closing argument. Raskin stood up. It was the first time he had stood since his opening statement. The movement was deliberate. He adjusted his jacket, he smoothed down his tie, and he looked around the hearing room at the reporters, at the cameras, at the Democratic staffers, who were watching him with the particular hope of students waiting for their favorite teacher to deliver a great line. When he spoke, his voice was not shouting. Raskin did not shout, but it carried the particular weight of a man who had spent the last 5 years with one specific form of moral authority, and who was now going to deploy all of it at once in a single minute of televised rebuttal. Senator Kennedy, with all due respect, and I mean that with the full force of the phrase, because what I am about to say deserves the word respect more than anything I have said in this hearing, I am going to address you directly on the record, and the American people can judge for themselves who is speaking the truth in this room today. I stood in the United States Senate in February of 2021 and prosecuted the case that Donald J. Trump incited a historic unrest against the government of the United States of America. I presented video evidence, I called witnesses, and I read the Constitution aloud, section by section, phrase by phrase, to a chamber full of senators who had been physically threatened by a M0B less than 5 weeks earlier. I laid out the case that a sitting American president had attempted to overturn the results of a free and fair election by encouraging an aggress VCR0WD to BR3ACH, this very building. The building we are sitting in right now, Senator Kennedy. The building where we are holding this hearing. He turned slightly, looking across the hearing room at the Republican side of the table. You, Senator Kennedy, voted to acquit that president. You stood on the floor of the United States Senate and decided that the man who had incited the events of that day against American democracy itself should face no consequences. Not because you thought he was innocent, because I have read your public statements from that period, and you did not dispute the underlying facts of what happened on January 6th, but because you accepted a legal argument about Senate jurisdiction over a president who had already left office. When the United States Capitol was breached on January 6, 2021, the rule of law was at CK'd. When Donald Trump told his supporters to fight like hell, he was telling them to at CK, the very foundations of the constitutional system that you claim to have studied for 40 years. And when you voted to acquit him, Senator Kennedy, you made a choice about which side of American history you wanted to stand on. And I will never, as long as I have breath in my body and a seat in this House of Representatives, let you forget that choice. So when you lecture me today about constitutional integrity, about the rule of law, about the duty of public servants to follow the rules, I want the American people to remember you are not the voice of constitutional integrity. You are the voice of a political party that defended the single greatest at CK on American democracy since the C-Vil-W at R. You are the voice of a party that placed its loyalty to one man above its loyalty to the founding document of this country. Don't you dare lecture me about the rule of law, Senator Kennedy. Don't you dare. He sat down. The Democratic side of the hearing room exploded into applause. Eric Swalwell stood up and clapped, his earlier humiliation forgotten in the heat of the moment. Dan Goldman followed. The Democratic staffers were on their feet. Several members of the gallery began to chant, "Raskin! Raskin!" before the Capitol Police quietly moved in to remind them that chanting was not permitted in a committee hearing. For a full 20 seconds, Jamie Raskin had reclaimed the moral authority of the second impeachment trial, the memory of January 6th, and the particular anger that progressive Democrats had been carrying in their bones for the last 5 years. The room belonged to him. It was the strongest single moment by any Democratic witness in any hearing that Kennedy had ever participated in. And Kennedy had participated in hundreds of hearings. Kennedy waited for the applause to die down. He did not interrupt. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, thoughtful. The look of a man deciding how to respond with precision to an argument that deserved precision. When the room was finally quiet, he began speaking. His voice was softer than it had been all day. "Mr. Raskin, that was a powerful statement. I want you to know that I heard it, and I want to respond to it carefully, because what you just said deserves a careful response, not a dismissive one. First, I voted to acquit President Trump based on my reading of the constitutional question about Senate jurisdiction over a president who had already left office. That position was held at the time by numerous legal scholars, including prominent liberal constitutional scholars such as Alan Dershowitz and Jonathan Turley. I respected your disagreement with that position then, and I respect it now. Reasonable people can disagree about complex constitutional questions. That is what reasonable people do. Second, I was in the Capitol on January 6, 2021. I saw the same things you saw. I said on the floor of the United States Senate on that same day, the congressional record is public. Anyone can pull it. That the breach of the building was a disgrace to the American constitutional order and that the people who participated in it should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. I said it on January 6th. I said it on January 7th. I have said it every year since. I am saying it again now. For the record, in this hearing, the events at the building were wrong. The people who did it were wrong. President Trump's conduct on that day was, in my professional legal opinion, indefensible. I want all of that on the record, in my own voice, so that no one watching at home can misunderstand what I am about to say next. He paused. The softness in his voice disappeared. But Mr. Raskin, and this is the part I want you to really hear because I think it is the most important thing I am going to say today, you have spent the last 5 years using the tragedy of January 6th as a shield against every question about your own conduct. Every time a reporter asks you about the late filing, you pivot to the historical unrest. Every time a congressional investigator asks about reserve trust, you pivot to Donald Trump. Every time somebody asks you about the Institute for Policy Studies, you pivot to democracy itself. And just now, when I asked you about your wife's $1.5 million payout from a fintech company, you pivoted to my vote in the impeachment trial. Mr. Raskin, at some point invoking January 6th, stops being an argument and starts being a deflection. And I think today, in this hearing room, we have reached that point. The events of January 6th were real. They were tragic. They were, as you correctly said a moment ago, the worst at CK on American democracy since the Seville W at R. I do not dispute any of that. Nothing I am saying today diminishes that. Nothing I am saying today should diminish it for anyone watching this hearing on C-SPAN. The people who breached the building deserve to be prosecuted, and the ones who have been prosecuted have received sentences that I personally do not quarrel with. But January 6th is not a universal defense. Mr. Raskin, it is not a moral shield you can hold up every time someone asks you about your own financial disclosures. It is not an immunity card against questions about your wife's nomination to the Federal Reserve. It is not a free pass from the Ethics in Government Act, which was passed in 1978, long before any of the events you are invoking. And Mr. Raskin, I am saying this with the full weight of 40-1 years of studying constitutional law, and with the full respect I have for your scholarship, which is real and which I have read. Using January 6th as a deflection is not honoring the memory of what happened that day, it is using it. And I think you know the difference. I think you have always known the difference. The applause stopped. Eric Swalwell slowly lowered himself back into his seat. Dan Goldman stopped clapping. The Democratic staffers who had been standing sat back down. The gallery went quiet. Jamie Raskin, the constitutional law professor, the second impeachment manager, the man who had just 15 seconds earlier commanded the entire hearing room with 20 seconds of genuine moral authority, slowly lowered himself back into his seat. His face had not changed, but something else had. The pen he had been holding in his right hand. The same black Mont Blanc pen he had used to take notes during his opening statement. The same pen he had brought to the hearing that morning in a leather case. The same kind of pen he had used to underline passages in his briefing binder during the second Trump impeachment trial 5 years earlier. The pen that had been a gift from his law students at American University Washington College of Law in 1996. When he had been promoted to full professor, the pen plunged from his fingers. It rolled across the committee table. It rolled over his prepared notes. It stopped against the base of his microphone stand. It did not fall off the table. It did not make a sound loud enough for the microphone to pick it up, but everyone in the hearing room saw it. Jim Jordan saw it from the chairman's seat. Josh Hawley saw it from Kennedy's side of the table. Kennedy saw it. The C-SPAN cameras saw it and caught it in their wide shot. And within 90 minutes, the clip would be circulating on the internet with the caption, "The professor drops his pen," and it would be viewed 41 million times before morning. Jamie Raskin did not reach to pick up the pen. He looked at it. He did not move his hand toward it. He let it stay where it had stopped against the microphone stand for the rest of the hearing. The professor had dropped his pen. Kennedy waited 10 full seconds before he spoke again. 10 seconds in a congressional hearing is a very long time. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of a room that was absorbing what had just happened. "Mr. Raskin, I want to end this session with one last reading from the article I wrote in 1984. The concluding section, page 934. He did not open the book. He had memorized this part. He had memorized it because he had written it, and because in 41 years he had not forgotten the sentences that had made him believe, as a young man, that the law was worth studying at all. Quote, "The Ethics in Government Act succeeds or fails based on whether the people who enforce it are willing to apply it to their own side. The temptation to make exceptions for ideological allies is enormous, because enforcement always feels like betrayal when the target is a friend. The only solution is a professional culture of disclosure that treats compliance as a duty, not a burden. Without that culture, the act becomes a weapon used selectively against political opponents and ignored when it constrains political friends." End quote. He paused. I wrote those words, Mr. Raskin, as a two-year-old, third-year law student at the University of Virginia. I was not yet old enough to run for Congress. I was worried, as a young law student worries about abstract problems that feel very far away, that the Ethics in Government Act would become, in the hands of future generations, a political tool rather than a genuine accountability mechanism. And here we are, 41 years later, in a hearing room in the Rayburn House office building on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 2026. And you are proving my year-old self right in real time. You spent 2 years, Mr. Raskin, as the lead impeachment manager for the second trial of Donald J. Trump. You argued that he should be held to the strictest possible constitutional standards for his conduct on January 6th. I disagreed with your conclusion on the jurisdictional question, but I respected the rigor of your argument. You cited the Constitution. You cited precedent. You cited case law. You were careful. You were precise. You were, in short, the kind of lawyer I have always admired, someone who believed that the rules were the rules. And while you were being careful and precise about Donald Trump, your wife was receiving $1.5 million from a financial technology company that would be regulated by the position to which she was about to be nominated. You failed to disclose the transaction for 8 months in direct violation of the exact statutory deadline my two-year-old self anticipated and wrote about 41 years ago. And when you were caught, Mr. Raskin, you called it technical. I will say this with the full weight of 41 years of studying constitutional law in 3 different institutions on 2 different continents. You cannot be a serious constitutional scholar and treat your own ethics violations as technical paperwork. The United States Constitution does not have a technical violations exception for professors. It does not have one for impeachment managers. It does not have one for the ranking members of House committees. It does not have one for people whose fathers founded influential think tanks in 1963. It does not have one for people whose wives were nominated to lead the Federal Reserve's banking supervision. The Constitution applies to everybody. That was the whole point of the Ethics in Government Act when Congress passed it in 1978. That was the point of my law review article when I published it in 1984. And that is the point of this hearing today, Mr. Raskin, whether you wanted it to be the point or not. The question is not whether you are smart. You are. Harvard magna cum laude. Harvard Law magna cum laude. 25 years of teaching constitutional law at a respected law school. All of that is real, all of that is impressive, all of that deserves the respect that I am giving you today. Even though less than an hour ago, you stood in this hearing room and called Louisiana voters too uneducated to spell habeas corpus. The question is whether you apply the standards you teach, and by your own public record, by the facts you have publicly acknowledged in press statements under your own name, in the National Legal and Policy Center complaint documents, in the Center for Renewing America ethics filings, and in the pages of Fox Business News and Business Insider, the answer to that question is no. You apply them to the other party. You invent technical exceptions for your own family, and when someone asks you why, you pivot to January 6th, and you call the person asking a historical smear tactician. That, Mr. Raskin, is not constitutional law. It is constitutional theater, and the American people watching this hearing, including the voters in Louisiana who, according to you, cannot spell habeas corpus, and who are nevertheless sitting in their living rooms right now, watching C-SPAN on a Tuesday afternoon in April, the American people can tell the difference. They have always been able to tell the difference, and they are telling the difference right now. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman. Raskin's response was quiet. The fight had gone out of him. Everyone in the room could see it. Josh Hawley could see it. Jim Jordan could see it. Eric Swalwell, sitting red-faced on the Democratic side, could see it. The pen was still rolled against the microphone stand. Senator Kennedy, I reject the characterization of my scholarship and my enforcement of constitutional principles. I have been consistent in my application of the law, whether to Donald Trump or to myself. I have publicly acknowledged the late filing. I paid the penalties. The record speaks for itself. I yield. Kennedy spoke one more line. His voice was softer than it had been all day, almost gentle. Mr. Raskin, for what it is worth, and I want you to know, I mean this. I did not come here today to humiliate you. I came here to make a point about the law I have spent 40 years studying. My granddaddy used to say, a smart man knows when he has been outmatched by a better argument. A wise man says so out loud. You are a smart man, Mr. Raskin. I have always thought so, whether you are also a wise man. That, I am afraid, is not something I can decide for you. Mr. Chairman, I yield my remaining time. Jim Jordan banged the gavel. Based on the testimony presented today and the public records cited by Senator Kennedy, this committee will refer the matter of Congressman Raskin's 8-month late financial disclosure to the Office of Congressional Ethics for renewed review. Additional questions concerning the Institute for Policy Studies disclosures will be referred to the House Ethics Committee. This joint hearing stands adjourned. The gavel fell for the second time. The room emptied in stages, and the stages told the story. Dan Goldman packed up first. He did not look at Raskin. He did not look at Kennedy. He gathered his papers, placed them in his leather briefcase, closed the briefcase with the 2 small brass clasps that made a quiet click, and walked out of the hearing room through the main doors. A reporter from CNN tried to catch him in the hallway. Goldman said 4 words, "No comment right now," and kept walking. Eric Swalwell followed. His face was still red. He had been silent for the last 31 minutes of the hearing, ever since Kennedy had referenced the Nancy Pelosi decision and the Axios report from 2020. He did not speak to the press on his way out. He walked past the Fox News camera without looking at it. He walked past the MSNBC camera without looking at it. He walked into the elevator at the end of the hall, and the doors closed behind him, and he did not come back. Josh Hawley stood up and walked over to Kennedy's side of the table. He extended his right hand. Well done, John. Thank you, Josh. I appreciated the Stock Act point. Roberts would have been proud of it. Hawley smiled. The rare Hawley smile, the one that his colleagues knew meant he was genuinely pleased about something, and walked out. Jim Jordan, from the chairman's seat, looked at Kennedy and nodded once. It was the wrestling coach's nod. Kennedy nodded back. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Jamie Raskin stayed at the witness table. He stayed there for 90 seconds after the gavel fell. The reporters in the gallery noticed. The cameras were still rolling. C-SPAN kept its cameras on for several minutes after the gavel on high-profile hearings, and the cameras captured Raskin sitting alone at the witness table, his hands flat in front of him, his pen still rolled against the microphone stand. After 90 seconds, he slowly reached for the pen. He picked it up with his right hand. He looked at it for a moment, the Mont Blanc pen that his law students had given him in 1996 when he had been promoted to full professor, and he slid it carefully into the inside breast pocket of his suit jacket. He stood up. He did not straighten his tie. He did not adjust his jacket. He walked across the hearing room toward Kennedy's side of the table. He walked slowly, the way a man walks when he is not sure what he is going to say when he gets to where he is going. He stopped in front of Kennedy's desk. He looked at the Harvard Law Review, volume 98, still lying open to page 912. He looked at Kennedy. "I would like to read that article someday." His voice was quiet. The C-SPAN microphones at that distance did not pick it up, but a lip reader hired by CNN later identified the words within 40 minutes, and the words were reported correctly. Kennedy looked up at him. His voice was equally quiet. "I'll send you a copy, Jamie." Raskin nodded once. He walked to the side door of the hearing room, not the main door where the reporters were waiting, the side door, the one the staff used. He opened it and walked through it, and the door closed behind him, and he did not come back. Senator John Kennedy's office in the Russell Senate Office Building is small, by senatorial standards, 40 feet by 30, 2 windows facing east toward the Capitol Dome. A desk that had been built in 1958 and had belonged to his predecessor, which Kennedy had insisted on keeping when he moved into the office in 2017 because the wood was good and the drawers still worked, and a man should not throw out a good desk just because it is old. Along the north wall, there is a bookshelf. The bookshelf holds many things: biographies of Lincoln and Jefferson, a complete set of the Federalist Papers in a 3-volume edition, old casebooks from his UVA law school days, a copy of the Louisiana Civil Code, a Bible his grandmother had given him when he graduated from Zachary High School in 1969. But on the second shelf, in the middle, there is a specific place Kennedy reserves for exactly 3 objects. He arranged them in that order deliberately. He has not moved them in 11 years. On the left, there is a photograph of his grandfather. The photograph was taken in 1952. Kennedy's grandfather, Mr. Jake Kennedy, who had served the Shreveport Fire Department for 41 years, is standing in front of engine company 4 inches his full turnout gear. He is smiling, the particular smile that old firefighters have when they know the camera is on them. Kennedy is 4 months old in this photograph, held in his grandfather's arms. The photograph is in a simple wooden frame. The frame is dusted weekly by the cleaning staff, but the photograph itself has not moved since Kennedy placed it on the shelf on his first day in office. In the middle, there is a bottle of Tabasco sauce. It is unopened. The seal is still intact. It was a gift from Kennedy's daughter Annie in 2008, on the day he was sworn in as Louisiana State Treasurer for the 3rd time, and she had written a note on the card that said, "Because a man should always know where the hot sauce is." The note is folded behind the bottle, where Kennedy can see it if he takes the bottle off the shelf. On the right, there is a leather-bound book, Harvard Law Review, volume 98, 1984. It has been on the shelf in that exact position since 2012. At 10:30 at night on the Tuesday after the hearing, John Kennedy walked back into his Russell Building office and closed the door behind him. He did not turn on the overhead light. He turned on the green banker's lamp on his desk because the overhead light was too bright for what he wanted to do. He walked over to the bookshelf. He picked up the Harvard Law Review. He carried it back to the desk. He sat down in the old leather chair that had also belonged to his predecessor's predecessor, and he placed the book on the desk in front of him, and he opened it to page 912, and he read his own article. He had not read it in 20 years. The two-year-old man who had written this article, this precise, earnest, over-footnoted, slightly pompous piece of legal scholarship, was a man John Kennedy had not thought about in a very long time. That young man had gone to law school because he believed in the law, not because he wanted to get rich. If he had wanted to get rich, he would have stayed in his family's oil and gas business the way his father had wanted him to. Not because he wanted to be famous. He had never been famous until he was 65 years old, and a video clip of him asking a judicial nominee about Article 3 of the Constitution had briefly gone viral. He had gone to law school because he believed in the particular way that young men believe things before life teaches them not to, that the law was the only thing that stood between civilization and the darkness of every civilization that had come before. He had written his first law review article about the Ethics in Government Act because he believed at 22 that public servants owed the public the truth about their money. Not as a technicality, not as a burden, as a duty. 41 years later, sitting at his desk in the Russell Senate office building at 1030 at night, with the Capitol dome lit up outside the window, and his glasses smudged, and his tie loose at the collar, Senator John Kennedy read the words of his own two-year-old self, and realized that the two-year-old had been right about almost everything. He had been right about the temptation to characterize violations as technical. He had been right about the difficulty of proving intent in disclosure cases. He had been right about the way the act would become a political tool if the people who enforced it were unwilling to apply it to their own side. He had been right about Jamie Raskin 41 years before Jamie Raskin had been elected to Congress, because the young Kennedy had understood, in a way that perhaps only two-year-olds and elderly theologians can really understand, that the law is only as good as the people who are willing to be bound by it. Kennedy closed the book carefully. He did not underline anything. He did not bookmark any new pages. He placed the book back on the shelf, between the photograph of his grandfather and the unopened bottle of Tabasco sauce, in exactly the position it had occupied since 2012. Then he picked up the telephone on his desk and dialed his chief of staff, Marcia Braftoft, at her home in Bethesda. "Marcia, it's John. I am sorry to call this late. Senator, everything all right?" "Everything's fine. I want you to do something for me tomorrow morning. First thing. Before any other meetings." "Yes, sir. I want you to send a copy of the Harvard Law Review, Volume 98, 1984, to Congressman Jamie Raskin at his office in the Rayburn House office building. Not the whole volume, just the article on pages 912 through 990. I want you to photocopy it, 3-hole punch it, and put it in a plain manila envelope." "Yes, sir. Don't sign the cover sheet. Don't include a note. Don't put my name on the return address. Just the article in a plain envelope, delivered by interoffice mail. Understood, sir? Anything else?" "No, Marcia, that's it. Just send the article. I'll see it's done first thing in the morning. Thank you, Marcia. Good night." "Good night, Senator." He hung up. He sat at the desk for another minute, looking at the green banker's lamp, and the old wooden surface of the desk, and the cracked leather of the blotter that had also come with the office in 2017. Then he stood up. He put on his suit jacket. He turned off the banker's lamp. He walked to the office door. At the door he stopped and turned and looked back at the bookshelf one more time. The photograph of his grandfather, the unopened bottle of Tabasco sauce, The leather-bound Harvard Law Review back in its place on the shelf. The way things ought to be. He turned off the light. He opened the door. He walked out of his office into the dark marble hallway of the Russell Senate office building, past the portraits of senators who had come before him, past the statues and the old brass fixtures and the silent night guards of the Capitol Police, into the Washington night. The country lawyer walked out of the Russell Senate office building into the Washington night, past the Capitol dome that had been lit up by electricity every night for 160 years, past the long rows of windows of the Senate offices where other senators were still working at their desks, past every monument to the idea that the law is the thing that stands between civilization and the darkness. Somewhere in Tacoma Park, Maryland, a constitutional law professor who had been a Harvard Law, magna cum laude graduate and an impeachment manager and a ranking committee member, was sleeping in a house filled with books and degrees and honors and the slow, hard-won accumulation of a distinguished legal career. Tomorrow morning, a piece of mail that he had not asked for would arrive on his desk in the Rayburn House office building. A 1 year old law review article written by a 22-year-old law student who had understood from the beginning that the law is only as good as the people who are willing to be bound by it. The article would be in a plain manila envelope. There would be no cover sheet. There would be no signature. There would be no note. The mailman would deliver the article. What Jamie Raskin did with it after that was not the mailman's job to decide. The mailman had done his part. The rest was up to the professor. In the final analysis, this was the day a country lawyer from Louisiana quoted his own Harvard Law Review article from 1984 at a Harvard law professor who had called Louisiana voters too uneducated to spell habeas corpus. The historical record will show Josh Hawley backing him up with a Supreme Court clerkship citation. It will show Dan Goldman's Yale law degree getting challenged on live television and coming up entirely empty. It will show Eric Swalwell rendered speechless by a single, factual reference to a prior leadership decision. And it will forever document Jamie Raskin dropping his pen on live television in front of millions of Americans. The fundamental truth established in Room 2141 is that elite credentials entirely devoid of character and consistent application are fundamentally worthless. The unfolding narrative of congressional accountability is far from over, and the precedents set here will reverberate deeply. The ultimate standard is that every constitutional law professor must be forced to live by the exact constitutional standards they demand of others. This moment stands as a powerful testament for anyone who has ever been systematically underestimated simply because of their accent, their zip code, their hometown, or the state listed on their driver's license. God bless the Constitution. God bless the University of Virginia School of Law, which took a skinny kid from Zachary, Louisiana, in 1974 and taught him to read a statute. God bless the Harvard Law Review for publishing the 7-8-page article that a two-year-old from Madison Parish wrote in 1984. God bless Oxford University's Magdalen College and Professor Tony Honoré, who taught a young Louisiana lawyer that Roman law was not dead, just resting. And God bless the country lawyers who still keep their law review articles on a shelf between a photograph of their granddaddy and a bottle of Tabasco sauce. Because that, my friends, is where the law really lives in America. Not in Harvard Square, not in Tacoma Park, in Shreveport, in Zachary, in Madison Parish, in the heart of every American who still believes that the rule of law is the only rule that matters, and that no man, no matter how credentialed, is above the law he claims to defend. The mailman delivered the article. The rest is up to the professor. Consider this profound reality as the heavy dust settles in that quiet committee room. Does the true measure of a person's character lie within the framed degrees hanging upon their office walls, Or does it reside quietly within the absolute consistency with which they strictly apply the rules to themselves? When the grandstand echoes finally fade into history, we are inevitably forced to ask ourselves who truly respects the foundation of justice when nobody is watching.